Special Operations, Covert Ops, Espionage, The Team House, with your hosts, Jack Murphy and David Park.
Hey folks, welcome to the Team House. This is episode 182. I'm Jack Murphy here with Dave Park. We're here tonight with Scott Mann. Scott is the author of Operation Pineapple and Game Changers. He is a retired Special Forces officer, served largely in Afghanistan, also down in Central and South America. And he was also part of the civilian effort to help Afghan allies escape from Kabul last year, and that's what Operation Pineapple is about. He is also the headliner of the play Last Out, which Dave and I both got to see when they toured through Manhattan recently, which is an incredible play. We're going to talk about it in a little bit. I mean, Scott Mann's done a lot. He's an interesting guy, and we're really excited to have you here on the show tonight, Scott, so thank you.
Hey, thanks, Jack. Hey, Dave.
Great to see you again, Scott.
Yeah,
man. I guess, I'll start off with you where we start off with all of our guests. I'd really like to hear about kind of your origin story and how you grew up and sort of what the path was that took you towards Special Forces.
It started for me as a kid, really about 14 years old, Jack. I grew up in a little logging town in Mount Ida, Arkansas. We didn't even have a stoplight. It was a small town. And when I was 14, I met a Green Beret who came into town to visit his dad. And the Green Beret's name was Mark. He walked into Harold's Soda Shop wearing his uniform. And the minute I saw this guy, I just knew it was what I wanted to do, what I wanted to be. And I didn't even know what it was. But he sat down with me and I was a run of a kid, really. I was a very, very small kid. And kind of a bullied a good bit. And this guy he sat down with me and he started telling me about Special Forces, the Green Berets, and how they work by, with, and through indigenous people and help them stand up on their own. And man, it was like I was in a trance. I just sat there with my jaw on the ground, listening to this guy talk to me about this little team that would go into places and immerse themselves in the language and the culture and the environment. And I just knew that's what I knew that's what I wanted to do. And I went home that day. I told my dad that was what I was going to do. And it never changed. From that point on, for the rest of my life, all I wanted to do was try out for SF.
It sounds like a Norman Rockwell sort of origin story in the soda shop, running into a guy in uniform wearing a Green Beret. It's amazing.
Yeah, up until the point where I think I recycled every school in the Army like 5 pathway to. So I think old Norman could paint that one.
Yeah, that kind of gets left out of like the Captain America movies, the part where you recycle Ranger School.
Yeah. I think I could have PCS to the gulag, man.
That's okay. What was Vaughn's platoon? I had an extended stay in Vaughn's platoon also, Scott. So.
Oh, okay.
Oh yeah. I was there through Christmas Exodus. So yeah.
I recycled Ranger School twice. I recycled the Q course twice. It was hard, man. I mean, of course it was hard, but I had a very, very challenging time getting through the pipeline, and but it never wavered. Even in those moments where it was like I'll get out of the Army before I give up on this. And I think the coolest thing, man, was after going through almost 18 years as an SF guy and about 23 years in the Army, I was able to look all three of my boys in the eye at my retirement and tell them that it was actually better than that 14-year-old kid had dreamed. And that's the truth. It really was. And it was because of the NCOs and warrant officers that I had the opportunity to serve around. I wouldn't trade it for anything, man. It was incredible.
Well, that adversity is a character building experience too. So
agreed.
Yeah. And I think, Scott, that it's really important. It's a really important message sometimes that people hear that, things happen at these schools. People get hurt, you mess up, things happen. And that's really the testament of spirit, is that the people who leave those schools bitter or they're just like, I'm done, I'm out, or whatever, that's not going to get you up the mountain when
when things
when you've got an 80-pound ruck on your back.
You're so right, Dave. And I will tell you, looking back on it, when I think about like the kind of the darkest, hardest times I had in combat and other elements of my professional life as an SF guy, it was really learning how to pick myself back up in those moments when I recycled and I had to start over. And, I can remember one time, I'm not kidding you, we were in the gulag and I was on a detail in the worm pit and I was pulling weeds as my graduating class marched onto the parade field to rehearse their graduation. And I can remember like that was one of the lowest points in my life, man. And I wanted to just crawl off in the woods, but just finding somehow the ability to keep pulling one weed after the other and
Right.
not withdraw, not pull back, and just keep doing my task. And eventually I was on that parade field. I learned that taught me more about combat and adversity and dealing with loss and all of those things in a lot of ways than the course did.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's funny because I think, we've talked about it with other people before, but I think we talked about it specifically with Mike Edwards about RRD selection, right? That a lot of people, and for a lot of younger people who are thinking about doing these courses, they're like, oh, I don't know if I can make it. It's like, that's just getting to your job. Like, you don't worry, like you train up for it and stuff like that, but no day in selection is harder than a mild day in combat.
Right. Yeah. And it's good. I think a lot of young people, I've had the opportunity to talk to a lot of young people about going into special ops. And I tell you, I don't know how you guys feel about it, but anytime a young person hits me up, I pretty much drop everything and talk to them because I remember how impactful it was when Mark talked to me. And that guy mentored me all the way to retirement, man. Like he stayed in my life
That's
all
amazing.
the way through when I retired. And it's a real thing, isn't it? I mean, I think working with our youth as they decide whether to do this or not, and I think how we engage young people on that is really important, particularly after we leave the special operations world. Finding ways to pay that forward to people that are coming into the pipeline.
Yeah.
That's super cool. So you came in, did you come in enlisted or you came in as an officer?
No, I was commissioned as an officer. To make it even more sporty, I was commissioned as a quartermaster officer.
Wow.
Yeah, and that's not what I wanted. That's the branch I got, and was not very good at it, and but was fortunate enough to still get through Ranger School and a couple other schools as the quartermaster down, and then went to Panama and then tried out for selection and made it and never looked back.
And so what year was it that you graduated the Q course and wound up on a team?
I was 96, but I didn't end up on a team immediately. I actually was. Because I already spoke Spanish to some degree from having been stationed in Panama, and I wanted 7th Group desperately. So I went ahead and took the DLPT, the language proficiency test, and did well enough to get 7th Group. But, I was not proficient by any means. And it just so happened that Ecuador and Peru in 1996, 97 had a border skirmish. And so a guy named Colonel Pat Higgins down in 7th Group was in the mill group, and he recommended a plan for special forces officers to go in on either side of the border with an Ecuadorian and Peruvian company grade officer, and then with 50 local soldados in that area and be like peacekeepers. So literally like the day I graduated, the next day I was on a C-27 heading to the MOMEP or to the Sinapa Valley to be a peacekeeper down in Peru for 6 months. So it was a while before I even got to a team.
So this kind of was living the dream, though. I mean, it was exactly what Mark had told you at the soda shop.
It was, man. And I'll never forget, like our base camp was on this little mountaintop, like something out of MASH. The only way in was this little C-27, which is like a Fisher Price. It's like a Fisher Price version of the C-130. And we landed there, and I started walking down the steps of the plane, and this guy was there to meet me, this SF NCO, and I'll never forget, his uniform was like hanging off of him. He maybe weighed like 115 soaking wet. It's like 5'2", had this big flop hat, that was like bigger than the rest of his body. And he stuck his hand out and he said, "Hey, sir, my name's Dick Large. How you like me so far?" And I was like, holy crap, this is unbelievable. And he, but that was my welcome to my first SF deployment, and an amazing NCO. But it was, man, it was exactly like I had hoped that it would be, kind of thrown out into the mission and able to kind of make an impact as a junior officer level right out of the gate. I mean, it was it was really crazy.
And so this program sounds super fascinating and plays into what we'll talk about in a bit about village stability operations, that you're an American officer down there with a Peruvian and Ecuadorian. I mean,
Yeah.
I take it the game plan was that you're going to put these people together in order to diffuse the conflict.
Yeah, it's a great question, Jack. And what I always thought was super cool about it was, first of all, it was a bottom-up mission, right? So Peru and Ecuador got into this border skirmish, and they had done that several times, and it could have gone full-fledged were it not for Colonel Higgins, who intervened from the Mill Group and said, look, I'd like to nominate a way to approach this. Put a couple of SF guys, one on each side of the border with these Ecuadorian and Peruvian officers and 50 local soldiers from whatever countryside we're on, and just put them there. And they approved it because they had no plan. They had no solution. And it worked. It stabilized the situation long enough to put in place lasting peacekeeping measures and eventually, de-escalate the whole situation. But what was critical about that, Jack, and I look back on it now, if you think about how when we got hit on 9/11, that's exactly what Colonel Mulholland and 5th Group did, was they nominated an approach to basically working with the Northern Alliance and the Pashtun tribes in the South. It was bottom up. If you look at Just Cause, when we went in there in 1989 and the Panamanian Defense Forces scattered out into the hinterlands and they were going to mount a very large operation to clean house, you had local 3rd of the 7th SF NCOs who were living in Panama that said, hey, we got a way to get these guys in without firing a shot. And they nominated a con-op where they called it Operation Ma Bell. And they flew out to local quartels where these Panamanian Defense Forces were by the hundreds, got on a payphone and called them in to surrender. And every one of them surrendered without firing a shot. And
Wow.
You don't hear about those missions, but I had the opportunity to see a lot of those firsthand in Latin America and meet the NCOs and officers that put them in play. And they were all bottom up. They were all very focused on local activity. And that really had a strong impact on me for the rest of my life, for sure.
And then the next, you did eventually take a team, and now we're talking about mid heading into the late 1990s. What was that like for you?
It was mostly work in the Andean Ridge. The drug war was really raging in Colombia and peripheral countries down there. Pablo Escobar had been taken out, and so there was a real sucking chest wound in that area as the FARC started to move into the narco trafficking business, and you had it was really ugly. So the bulk of my team time was spent down in the Andean Ridge area, working by, with, and through partner forces like the Commandos, the Lanceros, Fuerzas Especiales, and even Colombian National Police on drug interdiction and to some degree counterinsurgency, but mostly counter-narcotic, and spending a lot of time doing partner work and with some just iconic SF NCOs and warrants in the process.
As you look back on that time, I take it Plan Colombia played into this and everything else. And now, FARC becoming defunct and ostensibly some measure of peace breaking out in Colombia. I mean, if you were to AAR the Special Forces mission down there, or overall Plan Colombia, how do you reflect back on all of that in retrospect?
Pretty favorably, man. I look at that. In fact, I think I wrote an article when village stability operations was in pretty high gear. I think I wrote it for the Small Wars Journal. But one of the things I suggested, and I think several other people did this as well, was go take a look at Colombia. If you want to look at partnership in Afghanistan, go look at what we've done in Colombia over decades. I mean, I can remember in the 90s, you couldn't even really leave the quartel without seriously incurring some scunion from the FARC or the ELN. And then you fast forward to 2004, 2005, and even today, the Colombian Special Operations Forces are amazing. Their special ops aviation fly at night. I think they actually did end up even doing advisory work in Afghanistan and bringing Afghan officers over to Colombia to kind of take a look at it. But honestly, what I would say, Jack, is I look at that was a pretty modern country, a first world country. And it took, 30, 40, 50 years of persistent foreign internal defense to develop not just a security capability, but a participatory development capability, a dispute resolution, levels of governance that were acceptable, both in formal and informal civil society. It took a long time, man, multi-decade approach to FID, patient, persistent, that transcended different political regimes here in the United States. I I think that there's a lot to learn about working with partner forces and partner countries from what's been done in Colombia, the Philippines, and other places like that, where it was really old school.
One of the stories in the press back in those days was that Colombia was this. I remember it being described as America's next Vietnam, that it was the next quagmire that we were going to dip into, and that never happened because of this approach.
I think so, and I think the way that we really stayed focused on the elite forces. You know, the special operations forces carried a big load. I felt like there was a lot of good interagency cooperation as well, and that was really important. I mean, we had our problems just like everything else, but honestly, I believe it was a very targeted, focused, persistent approach that was incremental. You know, you just move the ball 5 yards down the field at a time. Every team that went down there was okay with that. And then you hand that organizational relationship off to the next team and you keep moving. And it was, in my assessment, one of the better models for what's possible for partner engagement that I've seen in the SF community. The Philippines would probably be another one.
I agree. And I would love to read that book, by the way. Somebody needs to write that one.
Yeah. I wish that there was more written on what our seventh group teams did, particularly in the 80s and 90s. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it just even like Operation Ma Bell. I mean, you'll see it some places, but to me, the fact that I was able to take my kids on spring break a few years ago down in an SUV and drive all over rural Panama, because frankly, that bulk of that country was left intact, you know, after Just Cause, because most of the PDF came in peaceably without a lot of shots being fired, rather than ravaging the countryside in a counterinsurgency campaign that would have probably been likely to take out the remnants of the PDF. But it was all bottom up, human engagement, local context. And yeah, man, I'm a big fan of that, particularly in the world we're in right now, because whether it's like whether it's a violent extremist organization like ISIS or a near peer threat like Russia, almost at the Soviet Union, I think we're going to be looking at partner engagement for a long time.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I need to track some folks down from, I can't remember. I don't think it was Colombia. I think it was in Bolivia, actually, that the Coast Guard was down there doing riverine operations.
Yes. Chimiray, Bolivia. But absolutely. And the Marines did a lot of riverine ops in those places. There was a lot of that. And, you know, again, I think that we're going to see like this there's nothing new under the sun. I think we are going to see a circle back to a really high demand for foreign internal defense. I mean, you see these special forces or the security force advisory brigades are starting to take this on, but partner work is not going away. And that's probably why I'm so worried about how things, and I know I'm getting in front of my headlights here, but what happened in Afghanistan, it really worries me because we're developing a nasty reputation for partner abandonment, starting with the Montagnards all the way up to now. And it's not good when you have to rely on surrogate work like that.
Yeah. So shooting forward a little bit, whereabouts were you in your military career when 9/11 happened?
I was a senior captain. I had already finished my detachment command time, and I was at Bragg and 7th Special Forces Group, commanding a support service company, service support company. That each headquarters support company, I think is what they called it. But it was one of those in every one of the SF battalions, and was not far from giving that up when we got hit. You know, I remember what was profound about that for me, and just in the fact that all these SF guys staring at the TV watching those towers fall, and I could feel the kind of the vengeance just rolling off those dudes. But my Ranger buddy Cliff Patterson was killed in the Pentagon when that attack happened, and it became very personal for me very, very quickly, and really set me off on kind of a direction where I personally kind of moved away from that by, with, and through thing, and was more focused on retribution and walking the enemy down. When I finally got in 2004 over to Afghanistan, that started a long time in that country for me. That really became my focus until we did VSO.
I remember you had this in your play, Last Out. There's this really profound line that sticks with me, where one of this, it was Brian playing a special forces officer. He says, "Our motto is no longer to free the oppressed, it's to punish the guilty."
Punish the guilty. That's right.
Was that from your experience?
It was a lot of lines in that play, found their way in from different people who quoted them and said different things. It's not an autobiographical play. There are autobiographical moments, but a lot of them were things that I heard or saw. And certainly punish the guilty. That was really a mantra, I feel like, Jack, for not just the special operations community, kind of our military writ large when we went over there. I mean, it was really kind of a punish the guilty approach cloaked in coin.
Right.
Right. It was that's just how we felt. I mean, and looking back on it, my God, I mean, if you think about what happened that day and what our lived experience was when that happened, I mean, it's not hard to fathom that was our mindset as a nation and certainly as a military. But it didn't serve us well after a couple of years. And so I tried to represent that in the play and it was true for me. Speaking personally for me as an SF officer, I got way too immersed in that direct action surgical strike approach as a way to solve the problem, and at a trit an insurgent, which of course was ludicrous.
I want to get a little bit deeper into that in your journey going from one approach to the next. I got to give a quick shout out to one of the sponsors for our show, which is sapgear.com. Want to take a moment. They sell a whole bunch of different items, a lot of escape and evasion items, things that definitely pertain to our audience, the special operations community, wristbands, necklaces that have all these sorts of escape and evasion tools built into them, handcuff keys, shims, things like that. And all the gadgets are always cool, all the 007 type gadgets, and they really do work, but they're only so useful if you don't know how to use them. So they do offer some literature also that's I've read through. This is the Counter, Kidnap, and Hostage Survival Handbook. This is how to open handcuffs without a key. This one is very cool in that it tells you how to open handcuffs from all around the world, not just American handcuffs. Like even I have the Granddaddy book over here, Lock, Safes, and Securities in 2 volumes, and they don't even go this deep into it. So this book right here is really helpful on the kinds of restraints you'll actually see overseas. And then this one is escape, different ways to escape other types of restraints and how to use the different type of equipment that SAP Gear offers. So that's sapgear.com. If you use the promo code TEAM, you will get 15% off your first order. So again, sapgear.com, the promo code is TEAM to get 15% off your first order. So Scott, back to you. If you could elaborate a little bit, tell us what that journey was like for you from the sort of punish the guilty direct action approach that took you eventually to village stability operations.
Well, I mean, there were teams already doing it the right way. And I think all the teams that were over there were doing some version of by, with, and through, whether that was with Afghan militia forces in the early days. When I rolled in 0405 as Battalion 3 for 1st to 7th, we got there at a time when there was this really odd transition going on, Jack, between the Afghan militia forces, what they called the AMF, which were really the residual forces from the Northern Alliance and the other Pashtun tribes that had resisted the Taliban and had, stood up with us when we invaded. And we were still working with them largely throughout the country. Most of the country was what was called a JSOA, Joint Special Ops Operational Area. And you just didn't have a huge conventional footprint, but it was happening. It was starting to get bigger and bigger, this conventional footprint. So it was like this confluence of residual UW bumping up against residual UW trying to pivot into FID. Mm-hmm. And then this large coin footprint coming into the country, camping out on the same basis that the Soviets had used, which should have been our first effing indicator about this thing. But it was a real just odd time. And so the Afghan National Army was in its infancy, and we put the Afghan National Army into play in Regional Command South and West in a pretty big way. And so that was my first experience in Afghanistan was really moving the Afghan National Army, which at the time was not good at all. And that was a really, really interesting time. Think about an army that it really didn't exist until after we invaded. A lot of people have thrown their hands up with the Afghan collapse saying, well, the army didn't do what it was supposed to do. And I'm like, the army was 19 years old. You show me a 19-year-old that does what it's supposed to do under duress.
Right.
And this army was no different. Like it was very nascent. But then, I found myself doing a couple of tours focused on targeting, walking the enemy down. And it was in 2007 on my plane ride back, Jack, on a C-17, where we had taken out a lot of Taliban in that rotation. And it was very evident to me. I talked to our J2 before I left, and he was like, and there's more Taliban in the rural areas than when we started.
Yeah.
And it was very, very evident that the rural insurgency of the Taliban was in full swing, and whatever momentum we had lost. And they were starting to march out of the mountains down into the urban areas. And this walk them down approach was not working. And, it wasn't long after that we signaled our exit under President Obama that there would be a timeline for departure. So it really hit me hard, that, wow, we are at a point now where we could actually get pushed out of the country and not have any capacity in place to stand on its own. And that was when I heard Dr. Seth Jones from RAND come down to SOCOM, and he was talking about how we had just got it wrong in Afghanistan. We had tried this top-down approach where we were trying to, inject a square peg into a round hole. We were trying to put like a liberal democracy and a modern 21st century army, into what is primarily a status society of tribes and clans and qualms with a little bit of contract society. And he said it needs to be the other way. If you look at the Musahiban dynasty from 1917 to the 1970s, it was primarily wherever the pavement ended, you had a bottom-up approach to governance, to security, and to development. And this is what was in place until the Soviets invaded. And if we were going to have any chance in creating an antibody to the rural insurgent, it was going to be bottom-up. And man, it was like Mark in the soda shop. He had me at hello, and I connected with him pretty quick, and we started hatching this approach for bottom up.
Yeah, so tell us more about that. How did you guys develop this VSO concept? And I take it you must have gotten some buy-in from the Special Forces Command and the higher ups into this program and this idea.
Yeah, I mean, it was very incremental, and there were a lot of really, really solid people involved in it. I was fortunate enough to kind of see it literally from its conception. Carlos Perez, a 7th Group officer, was involved very early on as well. And really the way it went, I mean, the VSO moniker will always and should be always attributed to General Scott Miller. I mean, that really was his, that title and that vision of it. The VSP that came from General Miller, and I can talk about that more in a second. But what happened before that, though, was at SOCOM, General Reeder was getting ready to go back over. He was a newly anointed 1-star, and they were going to put a special ops command of what they were calling White SOF at that time under one flag officer in Kabul. And I'd worked under General Reeder for years. We had a good relationship, and when I met Seth, I asked General Reeder if he would meet with Seth, and I don't think he was real thrilled about meeting with an academic from RAND. But when he sat down and heard him out, he was like, not only did he like it, he asked Seth to come over for 6 months, which Seth did. And we put in place a pilot program that they called Community Defense Initiative at the time. And it was basically 6 teams out in six rural areas working with local forces. And it was very much a pilot project, kind of a science project. And it wasn't until, Reeder, it was clear he wasn't going to take it any further than that. It wasn't until General Miller replaced him, and I'd worked for both of these guys. So I picked up the program. I'd already started working it with Seth under Reeder, and when he left, I continued it under Miller, and we really scaled it up, and it evolved into this program known as Village Stability Operations. But really, if I'm being candid, and then I'll let you guys jump in, but it really is. There's nothing new under the sun. It was remote area FID. That's what it was. It was the CIDG program from Vietnam,
right,
in just about every way.
Right.
And I had a lot of really great mentors from that program who helped me think that through. But that's really what it was in its essence. I mean, we gave it a new name and new branding maybe, but it really was remote area FID.
Scott, for some of our viewers who may not be so up on the acronyms, can you, first off, when we're talking about FID, we're talking about foreign internal defense, which is helping a country protect itself from threat actors. But can you tell us what VSO is and how it looks different than what we were doing in Afghanistan at that time?
Yeah. There's a lot of confusion around this. And I think it's important that we always try to clarify that, particularly because we're probably going to end up back in that country doing this again. I would almost guarantee it. But when I think about, that acronym, as you said, Foreign Internal Defense. So the way to think about it with special forces is special forces, they specialize in unconventional warfare, which is basically working by, with, and through indigenous people to overthrow a sitting government or a hostile regime. Just flip it. The other side of that is foreign internal defense, where you're working with the government to put down insurgents or lawlessness or terrorism. And it's really kind of a whole of nation approach. It's not just security, but it's development, it's governance, it's law enforcement. And it really is designed kind of to run out of the embassy. That's why it worked so well in Central and South America, because you had like this interagency hub. Whereas with Afghanistan, you didn't really have that, did you? You had this massive NATO-led contingent, and then you had this little bitty interagency thing that just said "Mother May I" all the time. But still, it was an attempt to kind of change the center of gravity in Afghanistan for where governance, security, and development emanated. We had this mindset, Dave, that everything was top down. It started with Kabul and it rolled down to the outlying villages. The problem with that is that's just not the way civil society has ever operated in Afghanistan. It's always operated the other way. It is primarily what they call a status society, which is basically ancestral. It's clan dominated. It's honor, shame, vengeance. It's tribal. And it is pretty autonomous. And the way that the government always operated was they had kind of an understanding with these outlying villages and tribes that they handled their own affairs, but that the government would have some minimal connection with them across security lines and taxes. But that was about it. And it was kind of a coexistence, and it was accepted. And that was really what VSO was. How could we help local communities restore their own autonomous capability to secure themselves, to conduct participatory development where they basically handled their own economic development at a micro level, and where they handled their own governance, which is primarily dispute resolution over resources, land, that kind of thing. And all of those had been destroyed in the Soviet occupation. Most of those civil society, it wasn't just Kabul that was decimated. Local civil society was decimated. So by moving into these villages, Dave, and living there, we allowed ourselves the opportunity to not just train security forces, but to identify sources of instability, systemic problems in food insecurity, grazing practices, bring in the right people to help reestablish that along development and governance, dispute resolution lines. And you're talking, long-term foreign internal defense. This is capacity building across all lines of effort. And we were predicting at that time 50 to 75 years of consistent foreign internal defense, which is why we stood up the Afghan Special Forces, that were in there working alongside us with 15-person detachments, and the commandos who could do the quick strike capability as well. So, it was well on its way. We gave it a good 2 years, and we saw a lot of success, and then we bailed on it.
And why did we bail on it? And let me take a stab at this, and you can tell me if this is right or wrong. But the nice thing about killing the bad guys or killing the enemy is that's easy to brief, right? This month we killed
X number
more than we killed last month. That's a sexy brief. How do you brief the success of a village stability operation?
About a 50 or 75-year timeline, right?
Yeah, right.
No, and I got told by several, and I'll leave their names out of it, but I got told by several senior officers, don't you ever say that in the brief. And I'm like, look, it's the truth. We've got to say this because if we don't, well, what happened. Mm-hmm. Where we think that, it got overloved, it got conventionalized. But to your point, Dave, absolutely. It just, how do you brief an improvement to, dispute resolution and grazing practices in Maywan? I mean, it didn't wash. And every commander was on a 6-month or 1 year expectation to win the war on their watch. I mean, I don't know how many times I heard outgoing commanders brief that the Taliban were fractured. I mean, seriously, over and over again. And the fact of the matter, they not only were they not fractured, but they were growing in capability. But there was this 2010 to 2012 window where we saw a demonstrable improvement in not just the local Afghan capability to stand up for themselves in a lot of these villages, but we also saw improvements in, again, regulating their own affairs at a civil society level, and then some connections with the government. But here was the problem. We were on a timeline, and General Petraeus and others really started seeing Afghan local police, which was a thing that President Karzai and certain members of the command, Special Ops Command, started to really harp on. And this was not VSO. Afghan local police was a kind of an extension of VSO in the sense that it was a way to put uniforms and formality to these local security forces and to hold them accountable to the government. And this was exactly what happened with the CIDG program. It is exactly how it fell apart. They took a very, very effective program that was designed to defend communities, and that was locally relevant and acceptable, and then they tried to overlove it and turn it into like an organism of the state, and it failed miserably. Same thing happened with AOP. We started recruiting, because Petraeus and others, I think, saw it as a way out, as a way to cover the exit in these rural areas while we worked a retrograde and focused on the urban areas. And the reality was that kind of worked for a while, but we stopped really working with elders and the legitimate governance authorities in these communities. And we started just recruiting large numbers of Afghans to fight as ALP. They weren't accountable to the local informal civil society leaders. And it became a militia that we couldn't control.
I'd like to ask a little bit about what VSO looked like from like a boots on the ground perspective. I mean, first off, how did the team guys respond to this program? I mean, was there resistance to it? Because I mean, much ink has been written about the drift towards direct action, but beyond that, I mean, you are asking a lot of the men in a sense. It is the special ops mission, the special forces mission, but I mean, living in a village off the local economy, I mean, that's a difficult life.
And I talk about this a lot in the play. There's this one line where Ricky says to Danny Patton, the team sergeant, he's like, "Danny, how much longer are we going to come back to this crap hole village, man? My ass smells like goat. My farts have sand in them, And he's like, dude, you got to take a shower. He's like, when's the last time you saw a shower? And it's this back and forth between these two guys about living in this village. But it was a big ask. And don't get me wrong either. I mean, there were a lot of problems with VSO. It was not a silver bullet by any stretch. But what it did represent was an approach to capacity building and stability that was in line with Afghan civil society. I mean, it was the one time where we really tried to understand what local actually looked like, and that was historically relevant. And that's where I say that had we stayed with it over decades, it could have been the right solution, as long as we maintained a CT force in the country and a strike force. But what it looked like when we first started it, Jack, to your question, I mean, it's a really good question. There was a lot of pushback, man. I mean, there were a lot of teams that were not happy about this, or there were members of the teams that were not happy about it. It was mostly the younger guys who had grown up in the Afghan fight, and it was certainly far different from what they were used to, where you were rolling out of your fire base, taking down a target at night, rolling back to your fire base. And this was about really going old school. And there was, some pushback, some resistance to it. But at the end of the day, man, the special forces teams that executed this across all the groups, and to some degree, other special ops units and even conventional forces, overall did a really, really good job in a very, very austere, tough environment. But it looked, there were different degrees, but the ones that stick in my mind was like this guy, Mullah Mike. Yeah. That's what the locals actually called him. He was a farm boy from South Georgia, and he and his team, they lived in an old abandoned building right there in the middle of the green zone. And they would patrol 5-6 times a day. He would stop and talk to every farmer that they came across, and they were engaging at local levels. They participated in discussions around dispute resolutions, mostly just listening. They did model farms where they looked at different agricultural practices. It was impressive. And he had so much local context that eventually people started standing up. because they saw his willingness to go to the rooftop and fight back, but also he really cared about what was happening at a local level, and he dug into it and he tried to help them figure it out. And over time, that paid off.
Was there like a re-education? I know that all of the younger SF guys, they had all been through the Q course, so they had all done the unconventional warfare stuff, but direct action is much sexier than FID, right? And for the very first part of the war, it was a direct action war. So you had a crop of young SF guys who came in and only knew direct action, wanted to be the door kicker. Was there a re-education period?
The two different cultures that is in your play. You talk about it.
Yeah, we do. And there's a guy named Ed Crute. He's still on active duty right now. He was involved in the Afghan evacuation in a really amazing way. He was very, very involved in VSO, one of the finest SF officers I've ever met. And Ed, he actually has written a paper. You guys should check it out. It's called the SF Identity Crisis. But he wrote it when he was doing graduate work at Duke. But it's really amazing.
I did read this paper. Yeah.
Yeah, and he really captures what you guys are talking about, which is this underlying kind of rift in the SF community over DA versus the by, with, and through approach. And it's a very real thing. And I don't know how it ends. I don't know where it ends up, but it's there. And it was very pervasive during the VSO era for sure. But what I would tell you was the way that we kind of came at this. Ed made a suggestion about 7 or 8 months into VSO, because we were throwing. Not only were we throwing SF teams into this that hadn't really done it, you were throwing SEAL platoons into this. You were throwing conventional forces into this, and nobody really had the level of localized, contextual understanding of civil society in Afghanistan that they needed to go into these places and do the Lawrenceian work that was required. I mean, if you read about T.E. Lawrence, the reason that he was so good and so adept at what the Badu thought and felt, and the reason he was able to write those 27 articles, was not as his time as a military intelligence officer, but his time as a geologist. Mm-hmm. The work that he had done as a geologist working at a profound local level. So what we did was we put together this thing called Academic Week. And Ed Crute suggested it, but basically, and Scott Miller really endorsed it. But any teams that they were getting ready to start their pre-mission training, Dave, they would have to come to this academic week for a week, and they would go through, and I ran them, but we would have experts on Pashtun tribal dynamics, participatory development by Dr. Kent Khan Idris, who actually wrote a book on that, if you can believe it, dispute resolution classes, low-tech agriculture, and all of these. We had people from the State Department coming to USAID, and they would all come together and go through this for a week, these different round robin classes, then go do their pre-mission training for 6 weeks or 6 months.
That's fantastic.
And so it really was a good turnaround to get people in the right mindset of what they were walking into.
Yeah. No, that's fantastic. It's a great way to adapt to the situation.
And you mentioned a few of the reasons why VSO was eventually, went defunct. Kind of where did you stand at that point as it kind of fell apart?
It was hard on me. It took a toll on me because I had really assured a lot of people that this thing was going to go the long haul. And when in 2012, I was already back at SOCOM running the academic weeks, but I was going back and forth, and I had a lot of, and all of a sudden we started pulling teams out of these villages. And as you can imagine, retribution was swift and It was ugly.
Right.
And I was getting calls on my my cell phone from elders begging me to help them somehow. And several of them were killed. Mm. And, that all happened at about the time that Jim Gant was going through what he was going through. I had been selected for a command that was not an SF battalion. And I just looked at it, had a long talk with my dad and my wife. And I just thought, I'm done, man. I'm not good with where this is going. I felt like a lot of the careerism that was surrounding these decisions and the way it was going down, I just didn't want anything to do with it. Mm-hmm. So I retired with prejudice. I turned down the command and left the Army in 2013.
If I could ask a sort of philosophical or maybe even Zen-like question, it strikes me that America's cultural style lends itself towards direct action. We like our high-tech weapons. We like laser-guided missiles, all this kind of cool tech. It seems that our culture doesn't lend itself towards counterinsurgency, towards village stability operations. I mean, your book really spoke to me on multiple levels, but it does strike me, I have to think or suspect that this type of local approach, it really does require special people. It requires even unique singular people like T.E. Lawrence, like Jim Gant, who is he's about as colorful and as singular a person as you can possibly imagine. And people like you who have this sort of mix of special ops and intellectual and academic knowledge that you're willing to combine the two. Do you think, setting aside the singular individuals, can America ever really grasp this way of not just fighting, but I mean, let's call it what it is. It's nation building.
I prefer to think it's a great question. I prefer to think of it as capacity building, just because I think if you really stop and think about it, it is a capacity that you're putting in place, and it's an antibody that you're leaving. And we do actually have, Jack, a lot of precedent in our country for doing this well. The problem is it's just not sexy. And it doesn't, like as Dave said, it doesn't brief well. And we've kind of, I don't know what you guys think, but I do feel like during the 20-year war, we did evolve into kind of a myopic focus on this attraction to direct action and surgical strike. I mean, like the tactical thing got really big. It still is. I mean, there's people that just follow that stuff and are enamored with it, and the public's drawn to it. And look, I get that. But I do believe, honestly, that if you look at how, for example, the Special Forces community assesses its people, how we, the way that we train, the Robin Sage event that we run, I think that honestly, it's what we were designed to do. I mean, if you look at the partisan work we did in World War II, work with the Montagnards in Vietnam, I think it's very much within our capability. And I think but you ask a really key question is can we tell the story? I look at what happened with VSO, and I put a lot of blame on me, man. I did not, because I was in a good spot to run the seams on that mission. And I failed to tell that story at a strategic level, I did not get it across to general officers and admirals and others that needed to understand that this was a long game. This was a multi-decade endeavor. And, those of us who were deeply involved in this, we did not tell the story well enough. That narrative landed at the feet of policymakers and decision makers. And at the end of the day, no one really knew or cared that this long-term program had been in place and that it was going to have a significant effect on retribution. And I think the same thing, you could make the argument, happened in the Afghanistan collapse overall, right? I mean, the Afghan special operators were carrying 98% of the load. They were actually very effective against the Taliban. And had we just maintained a foreign internal defense relationship with them, along with a CT capability, I firmly believe that it could have been a very, very different outcome. But yet there was no recognition or appreciation at all for capacity building of that nature. It was literally just close the book. And so that's really why I wrote the play, man. I wrote the play because I wanted civilians and policymakers and decision makers to, at an emotional level, feel what it means to be the last out, to not be the first in. There's plenty of movies on that, but the ones that go day after day, month after month, year after year, living in these local areas, doing this work. I want people to feel that at an emotional level, to understand that it's not only is it a very viable thing to do, it's a very essential thing, and it comes at a great cost to the people who do it. Because
it's like you're not just fighting, you're opening yourself up and becoming more like the local people. I mean, you write a lot about the importance of having empathy in your book and coming to empathize with the local population.
Yeah, for sure. And, the Special Forces community, like their soft brothers, endured horrific KIAs and wounded in action. Yeah. And a large chunk of it was during the Village Stability Program. Why? Because they were literally encroaching on the area where the insurgent swims, which was the local population. And as a result of that, the insurgents came at them with all 4 feet. And, it comes at great cost. I mean, this kind of work, whether it's community policing in East LA or whether it's community engagement in, Eastern Afghanistan or Somaliland, the bottom line is, to do this kind of work, it requires you have to make a human connection with these folks. It's not just about suitcases full of cash and cloak and dagger. It's about making real human connections, but also having the game to sling lead and do what you have to do when it becomes surgically coercive. And that's, I say that the modern day Green Beret, to do this kind of work, needs to be a combination of John Wick, Lawrence of Arabia, and the Verizon guy or the Sprint guy, or whatever he's called. Like, relationship-based connectors who just happen to be lethal. And I think it's needed more than ever.
What do you think needs to happen in terms of our policymakers because we did this in Vietnam, we did it again now. There's a great book that could actually be written. It was written comparing the British in Malaya to the Americans in Vietnam, called "Learning How to Eat Soup with a Knife."
Yeah,
and they could reprise that now with our experience in Afghanistan, because we basically repeated everything that we did in Vietnam. We just took a lot longer to do it. But what do you think needs to happen at a policy level when these, the next time we get engaged in a war like this?
Well, the first thing is we need some friggin' accountability and lessons learned over what happened, for starters, and this is where I don't get a lot of Christmas cards from Fort Bragg these days, because I just believe that right now there has been no institutional learning from what's happened. There's been no accountability and there's been no learning. We literally wholesale abandoned our partner force, even men who served in our regiment from special forces. We abandoned them. We left them to die and be hunted and killed. And, it is hilarious to me that the Special Forces Regiment still has a podcast publicly out there called The Indigenous Approach. That we could, that our regiment could put that out there right now after what happened. Now, you can blame that on policymakers all day long, but the fact of the matter is, we abandoned our allies, our commandos, our special forces, our KKA, in ways that it's going to affect our national security for years in terms of how we're able to partner. And the fact that we're still claiming in any way to have an indigenous approach that you'd want to listen to on a podcast, to me, it's just striking. And I just don't understand it. I don't understand why we're not hot washing the hell out of this and trying to figure out what we need to be doing to reclaim some level of credibility in the world on partnering. Because everything that I've heard my brothers and sisters in the active duty community in SF talking about, they are embarrassed by it. They're getting out of the service because of it. It's a real thing. And the Solve for Life community is terribly up in arms over it. So, I think for starters, there needs to be like some serious institutional accountability and crystallized learning over this thing, instead of just turning the page and pretending like it didn't happen. And until that happens, I don't know that anything's going to change, Dave, because it's such a moral injury on our community. It's such a violation of what we were taught to not leave a partner like that. I don't know how we ever move forward, and I don't know how we won't again do this kind of systemic abandonment.
Now, when you say at the Special Forces level, I mean, it was a lot of Special Forces soldiers and Special Forces veterans who actually made the moves to get them out. Just like in Vietnam, it was the veterans, not the government, who moved to get out the Nungs, the Hmong, and the Montagnards.
100%. Let me be clear.
Yeah.
I'm talking about SF senior leadership.
Okay.
And I talk about that explicitly in my epilogue. I'm talking about SF senior leadership. I'm talking about soft senior leadership and policymakers, at the DOD, DOS level. I haven't seen any accountability or crystallized learning that's come out of this at all. But as far as like the regiment itself and the NCOs and the junior officers who risked their careers, I mean, they were the reason the ones that got out did.
Yeah, you mentioned that in your book, that like some of the active duty soldiers put send all on blast to people that they probably shouldn't have, but they were so frustrated with the situation.
Before we jump into the book, because just trying to more or less keep it in a chronological timeline.
For you, yeah.
You retired with extreme prejudice, I think was what you said. How did post-retirement life go for you, and how did that lead into the creation of your play, Last Out?
Yeah, no, the retire with it was basically when you turn down a command 3 times, you retire with prejudice. In other words, or you're not going to get promoted, and so there was nowhere for me to go as a result of that decision, and it was okay because it was time for me to go, and so I left the military. Had a really tough transition out of the Army. And I think a lot of it had to do kind of with the conditions that I left under and seeing what happened with VSO and the retribution that happened. That was almost a foreshadowing of what was coming in 2021. And it really affected me. I became severely depressed and nearly, was having suicidal ideations about 18 months after my retirement, and was pretty lost. If I'm being honest, I didn't know where I was supposed to go, and was fortunate enough to locate a couple of mentors, civilian mentors. And one of them was a former pro football player named Bo Eason. He and his brother, Tony Eason, had played in the NFL. Tony was a quarterback for the Patriots. Bo was a free safety. Both played in the 80s. And Bo had blown his knee out multiple times and ended up becoming an actor, a playwright, and a professional storyteller. And I met this guy at an event, and I just thought, man, as I was watching him tell his story from the stage, and he was talking about, hard things and trauma and loss, but yet he held the audience like the audience wasn't even breathing as he was talking. And I just thought, man, that's what I want to do. And he talked about taking this TNT that was inside him and turning it into something positive. So I started training and working with Bo as a storyteller, Jack, and ultimately, started a leadership company called Rooftop Leadership, where I really worked on the human connection skills that I'd learned as a Green Beret and teaching that storytelling, active listening, nonverbal skill set to entrepreneurs and corporate leaders. And on the nonprofit side, started a nonprofit called The Hero's Journey, where we started teaching storytelling to veterans as a way to heal themselves, as a way to reconnect with their purpose, and frankly, to own rooms when they went in there and bridge those civil military gaps, which ultimately led to the play. I had been given a project. I was taking some acting classes to become a better speaker. And one of our projects was a little 5-minute one-person show about a silly band. You had to use a totem. And it was a silly band that my son, Braden, had given me in the war. And I just told the story as the silly band and, going through attacks by the enemy and being told to, be taken off by superior officers, and how my master didn't do that and brought him home. And it was just this, kind of a funny little one, but it really resonated with the people in the audience because it gave like the home front perspective. And I think just kind of a look through the eyes of kind of a guy that was working the local fight in Afghanistan. And a lot of people were like, you should make that a play. So I started working on it. And, 6 years later, 16 cities in a tour in 2019, and 250 PTS interventions in lobbies, and 75 Gold Star families, and a film on Amazon Prime. It's just been this journey, this iteration. It's come full circle, and now we're getting ready to kick it off with the Gary Sinise Foundation as a tour in 2023 to help heal from the Afghan collapse.
Yeah, Dave and I both had the opportunity to come and see your play
like 2 years ago, like when the show was in its infancy.
Yes, and you guys need to come see it now, Dave, because it has totally evolved. The ending is completely different. New actors and some old actors like Brian are still in there, but it is, it's still the same protagonist, Master Sergeant Danny Patton, but it's a whole new twist on the play. It addresses the Afghan abandonment, and honestly, guys, I think that I believe we're on the front end of a mental health tsunami with our post 9/11 population. I think we're on something that is coming our way, and this moral injury from Afghanistan has really amplified it.
I told you this. So after the play, we went to the bar and we had a chance to talk with you. And I'm pretty sure I told you this, but I wasn't looking forward to seeing your play because I was going to go. I support veteran efforts and whatever they do, but generally, I think when veterans put something to paper, a lot of times it's very on the nose, right?
Yeah.
It's very on the nose, and sometimes it's indulgent, indulging, and your play was great. It was. I was very surprised. I was riveted. It was great. It was great storytelling. It led the audience. It didn't like preach.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember I had a real fear that it was going to be very dark. I mean, not that this isn't a huge spoiler, but the first scene of Last Out is the protagonist dying in Afghanistan, and
Spoiler alert!
that's the first scene of the play. I mean,
Yeah.
and then through that you see him. You learn about this protagonist and his whole journey through special forces, through his entire life, through deployments, and it's not just a dark play. It's a play about somebody's life, all the good times, the bad times, the funny times, the goofy times. And I thought what your play captured, which I had never ever seen before, not in a book, not in a movie, not in a documentary, was that journey that I think so many young men had, joining special forces, getting on a team, going on these deployments, coming back. I mean, it was like all there encapsulated in 2 hours, and I'd never seen anyone capture that with so much cultural awareness that you managed to pack in there.
I appreciate it, Jack. It means a lot, man. And the fact that you guys came, and I hope you'll come see the new version of it.
Oh, absolutely.
What I will tell you is that the way and then we just kept that thing going on the road. And here's what I've seen on it is that honestly, there's a couple of things that usually happen. You've got this. There's a study out recently from Better Together that says that 3 out of 5 veterans feel like strangers in their own country. 70% of Americans say they want to help veterans move on past the long war, but they don't interact with them. And almost all of the veterans and civilians surveyed said we need less parades and ceremonies and more community engagement and more storytelling. And so, as a way to bring civil society back together, we put them in this room, and in that room, you have veterans, you have military family members, you have civilians that have never heard the crack of a round, and they're all sitting together, and they go for this ride with Danny Patton as he experiences, as you said, in the very beginning, he's mortally wounded and he needs to let go so that he can ascend to Valhalla. And this whole play is about letting go.
Right.
At the end of the day, for the veteran, the military family member, and even the civilian, we're all holding on to something.
Right.
That we need to let go of, that we need to ascend. And that's really at the heart of the play. But what we've started referring to it more lately is it's also our emotional breaching tool. The play, it's the talk back afterwards and the conversations that happen like we had in the bar, and the conversations where the husband and wife on the way home who have both buried a lot over 30 years.
Right.
And they finally talk about something that happened in the play because the story gave them permission to do that. And, I've seen this so many times, guys. And, believe it or not, I didn't write the play for veterans. I didn't. I wrote the play for civilians because to me, this goes back to the questions you guys were asking. How do we prevent this from happening again? How do we get policymakers to understand? I think they have to feel it.
Right.
I think you can give them all the PowerPoint briefings in the world and books, but until they feel what it's like to hold your buddy in his final moments, or to say goodbye to an Afghan elder, knowing that you're never going to see him again,
right?
Knowing that somebody's going to kill him, but and that you're going to have to carry that the rest of your life. Like, until you actually feel that in a room with the people who did it, it's just something that happened over there, and you don't have to think about it. But when we're done with this play, man, you've gone for the ride, and you can never unsee it. And veterans in the process get the opportunity to see their life on the stage in a completely safe environment and make their own meaning out of it and heal and validate in the presence of their fellow neighbors. And I'm like, hell yeah, because you deserve that. And you deserve to know that what you did mattered, and we love you, and we're never going to stop telling your story. Like, that's the other side of it, but it's really the civilian impact that I'm after anymore.
Yeah. And I want to caveat, I want to add to all of that for people listening, is even though it's written for civilians, it is not, there's no thank you for my service. There's no shame on you. There's no woe
It's very
is me.
real. It's very real, very raw.
It's just accompanying somebody along their journey and taking whatever you want from that. There are no preachable moments in it or anything like that. It's just a good story. It does what a good story should do, which is, it should be cathartic for people.
Yeah, and we don't even really use props. We have like 7 wooden blocks in the wall of honor. And it's even more metaphysical now because the play basically takes place in Danny's mind in the minutes that it takes him to succumb to his wounds on the battlefield. It's the whole thing. The whole play takes place really in just a couple of minutes. It's just the synapses in his mind firing for the last time. And, it's an opportunity for every person because storytelling by definition is a sense-making tool. That's what it's for. Story exists for humans, and it has for 70,000 years, to make meaning out of their lived experience and the lived experience of others so that they don't have to get scuffed up like the other person did.
Yeah.
And that's, why we've accelerated in many ways as a civil society is we're story animals. And that's all this is. It does follow the structure and the expectations of good storytelling. And there's no preconceived agenda. It's not pro-war, anti-war, Democratic, Republican. It's all about reconnecting around the hard subject of war and shared perspective, right? I mean, that's really, at the end of the day, that's what we need more of, I think.
Yeah. I don't know what you guys were pumping into the air as a sawdust or baby powder near the end, but it got me.
Yeah. Wait till you see the new ending.
The play was, or is it still available for people to view online?
It is. Yeah. We put it up. We went ahead and raised about $250,000 on our own, Jack, as a nonprofit. And we filmed it with a veteran crew. But it's the original cast members. It's on Amazon Prime, Vudu, Google TV, and Apple TV.
Cool.
And all the proceeds, 100% of the proceeds, go back into the hero's journey. So if for some reason you can't get to the play, or even if you do, and you want to see it on Amazon, it's pretty cool to watch on video as well.
We'll put a link down in the description of this video for folks who are watching this on YouTube so they can go check it out.
Now, when you so this was two and a half years ago that we saw it. Did you go into a hiatus where you continued to run it? Like, what brought it back in a new fashion?
That's funny. I was done, man. I have a rooftop leadership business and we run our storytelling workshops for veterans. So I stay pretty busy and, I'm an empty nester now, man. I can chase my wife around the house, uninterrupted and kind of at that point in my life. And all of that was right about the time that the Afghanistan collapse happened. And we had put the play up on film at that point, and I was content to just let it go. 53 years old, it's getting challenging to play like a team sergeant who's fit for combat and all that good stuff. But what happened was when the Afghanistan collapse occurred through a couple of connections, Gary Sinise saw the film and he contacted me and we started talking about it. And, Gary had done a similar thing, Dave, with a play called Tracers in 1982. He talks about it in his book, Grateful Americans. Great book, Grateful American. And in that, he talked about how he saw this play Tracers that was about the Vietnam War, written and performed by Vietnam veterans. And he brought it up to this new little theater in Chicago that he and an actor named John Malkovich and a few others were starting called Steppenwolf. And they put it up there and it had a really profound impact on local veterans and the community at a time when people were trying to make meaning out of the Vietnam experience. And when I read that, I was knee deep in putting the play up. And I was like, man, this has been done. If only I could get this in front of Gary, he would get this. And I tried for years to try to get it in front of him. And as you can imagine, he's a very hard guy to reach when you're doing a grassroots effort like that. And so I never got it in front of him. But it was so funny that when I quit worrying about it and we retired the play, I get a phone call from him. And he's like, hey, this thing is a post 9/11 Tracers. We talked about the fact that we were on the front end of a mental health crisis for our post 9/11 veterans as a result of Afghanistan and a few other things. And I just said, I think we could do a lot of good with this play. And he said, how about if I produce it? So we made the decision right then and there. And this was not more than 8 months ago. And we're kicking it off in Steppenwolf. We're going to be in DC first, January 6th through 8th, and then Steppenwolf, January 20 through 21. And then we're going on the road on another national tour, but it will be as part of the Gary Sinise Foundation.
That's fantastic. I know he does a lot for veterans
Oh man, he's such a good dude, and he does so much for not just veterans, but military family members and first responders. And, he has just given us complete autonomy to bring the play back. And I'm telling you, even if you've seen the play, it is a completely different play. I did a rewrite in August. It has things from the Afghan abandonment. We have new cast members. The operators that were on the periphery of Danny have whole new roles and interactions with each other. And then the ending is brand new. So there's a lot about the play. Every city we go to, we do storytelling workshops. We do PTS interventions with our counselors, suicide prevention. We honor families of the fallen and gold stars. It's just a whole weekend of community engagement and really just celebrating the veterans in that area, the active duty in that area, the military families, and our gold stars, and just telling them that we love them and that what they did mattered, and that it still matters, and that we're always going to tell their story for them, and that's, for me, the coolest thing is to be able to go in there and let them autobiographically locate themselves in that story and in the presence of their neighbors and their kids and validate them, man, because they deserve it.
Let's talk about the withdrawal, because that for anybody who worked first off, for anybody who fought there, the withdrawal, the way it happened, hurt. I think all of us thought we should withdraw in some way, or most of us did, but the way it happened hurt for people who fought. For those of us who worked hand in hand with the indigenous, it was particularly brutal because, like you said, it's like leaving your friends, your family, your brothers in arms behind. What happened for you in like the days leading up to it? Because the book, so Operation Pineapple, it's an amazing book, and I highly suggest people read it. One, it's a great read. It's like a thriller that happens in journal entries in a way. Each chapter is basically a day and is a page to 3 pages. But it also, in addition to the work that you guys did, it really paints the picture of what was going on outside of the Kabul airport, which I don't think we did not get a sense of that in our media.
Right. We didn't. And thank you for the kind words. It was it was a book I never intended to write. Frankly, really didn't want to write, even after it all happened. But I decided when I did decide to write it, I had really, the whole thing affected me just like it did you and so many others, just really negatively. And maybe it was the lack of sleep and just the stress that came from it at an age that, I'm not really used to doing that. It really took me down. And by November, my wife and several of my best buddies kind of had to do an intervention on me. And not like, hey, you got to stop doing what you're doing, but we got to find a way to do something a bit healthier here, because we don't want to see you go back to where you were in your transition when you got out. And what I decided, Dave, was my days of, managing Afghan cases and being a task force commander were long gone. And so I divested we stood Pineapple down. I divested the Pineapple manifest of thousands to another nonprofit that was frankly much better suited than me to handle it. And what I got back to was my storytelling. I'm a storyteller, and I committed myself to writing the book. And we did a ton of research on this thing. We interviewed, I just can't tell you how many, not just Pineapple passengers and flock, but also people in the government. We had guys in Pineapple who actually wrote the report for CENTCOM on the ISIS-K explosion. I interviewed State Department. These were all people that frankly were risking their careers to do the right thing. And all of them were willing to talk to me. Some of them, we changed their names. But it was a brutally researched book. I mean, we researched like crazy, hours and hours and hours of Zoom interviews, because like you said, I wanted to tell the story around 2 basic questions. What does a promise mean to you, and how far would you go to honor it? That's it. That's all I cared about. And then I asked that question to the relevant parties, but it's really told through the lens of the Afghans, the at-risk Afghans who risked everything, and their partners who tried to help them. And that's it.
And what they were going through was insane, and it's captured very well in this. Like,
yeah, it's unimaginable.
No, I mean, getting to the gates was dangerous. Then just being at the gates, women were giving birth at the gate. Like people were getting trampled. It was insane. So can you sort of tell us what was the genesis of Operation Pineapple? How did it go from you trying to help a single Afghan into this expansive operation?
I mean, it started with a lot of reluctance. I didn't want to get involved in any of this again. You know, I'd pretty much moved on with my life. I'd retired in 2013. I was in a place of restoration, in a place of healing, and it really felt good to be there. And so to get sucked back into all of this again didn't feel very good. I didn't want to do that. And really, when Nizam, my friend who was an Afghan commando, was in duress and it looked like he was going to get captured and killed by the Taliban, that's when I got involved at that point, Dave. And again, by getting involved, I thought I'll just help him get his SIV visa, or I'll try to get somebody at Army Special Ops Command to pay attention to the fact that we have a guy on our regimental books who is hiding in his uncle's house like Anne Frank with the Taliban texting him. But this was also a guy who had been shot through the face defending American SF, who had been shot 3 times in the chest plate by ISIS-K. He had worked VSO side by side with me and other guys like Mullah Mike. And he was highly respected, and he had gone to our Q course. I mean, he was an 18 Bravo weapons sergeant. And to leave this guy alone and not get him out of there, it was starting to have an effect on me that I just couldn't live with that. And so it was when he said to me right after the collapse in Kabul, he said, "Sir, everybody's gone. You know, my teammates are gone, my generals are gone." He goes, I'm not afraid to die. I just don't want to die alone." You know, and man, they just floored me. It hit me right between the running lights. And I realized that we were going to have to try to do something. So I got together with a couple of retired guys, including Congressman Mike Waltz's staffer, and we just started working it. And we just, did what a lot of other veteran groups did. We worked the phones, the relationships, and we managed to help him move through the city and get through the wire and onto an airplane. And then the transition, and the reason that Pineapple is that he was given a code word to say at the gate to get let in. And because he didn't have any credentials or paperwork or anything. And we ended up talking to a diplomat who just happened to be a former SF guy, if you can believe that. And, we told him the story in like 3 minutes of Nizam. And he said, "Tell him to say pineapple." Right. And so we're screaming, "Dude, say pineapple," because they're about to toss him out. And Nizam's never the type to make a wave or anything. So he just walks over to the bearded special operator and he says, "Excuse me, sir, I'm the pineapple." And they let him in, but that became like the hilarious meme for us, and that's what we called ourselves, was Task Force Pineapple. But the Pineapple Express really evolved into that open sewage trench and a 4-foot hole in the fence that was manned by some guys from the 82nd Airborne, the White Devils, who we got in touch with, and we basically put in place an underground railroad. And we moved hundreds of Afghans through that sewage canal up to the hole in the fence where they would do challenge and password, show the pineapple on their phone, and get pulled through and taken across the airfield in the Hilux over to a C-17 and shipped out. And that became our mechanism, and it worked for somewhere between 750 and 1,000 at-risk Afghans and their families.
When you say that Nizam made his way to the airfield and then, got in, even that was a story in and of itself. It's crazy what he went through. It's crazy what everybody else went through. And the stories are riveting. And it's interesting. I've lost my train of thought because you talk about the sewage trench they had to go in through. Yeah. And even that, the reason they could do that is because it was so filthy with human waste and everything. The Taliban wouldn't mess with them.
Wouldn't get in it. They wouldn't get in it. And for the first couple of days that, before the bomb went off, we were able to use that thing pretty effectively. And I have to say, man, like, look, I would love to sit here and tell you guys that I came up with this mechanism, but it was really an SF guy named Zach who had gotten out and had become an inner city school teacher in Syracuse. And I had never met him. But he had done VSO in 2011. He was an amazing, amazing young man, and he came in through LinkedIn, if you can believe that, into Pineapple. But guys, how you meet these people in our world, and you just know immediately there's something special about them. Like they're just you just immediately this is the person that you want, like, in charge. And he came. He's made, at the time we were getting some people out, but it was almost a stalemate. And he said to us, he's like, we just finished studying Harriet Tubman in my class. And, it's one of my favorite subjects to teach. And he's like, what if we constructed an underground railroad? And I just listened to him talk. And I thought, you know what, Zach, you run with that, pal. You tell us how to do that and we'll do it. And he really did. He put this thing together. He designed the approach and how it would work. He connected with the 82nd guys and he put it together and it worked, and this happened a lot. I think with not just our volunteer groups, but a lot of volunteer groups was this singular focus on helping our partners and nothing else. I went back through our Signal chat room, guys, days after it all ended. And there were literally thousands of entries, as you could imagine, from 150, volunteers in there and all of that chaos. The word Biden was only mentioned one time and the word Trump was never mentioned in all of that. And the reason was, as you know, there was no time. It was all about doing what was right, doing what needed to happen. And I just thought, man, what if we operated like that as a nation, even for a day?
Yeah.
That's, you included a lot of those Signal chats in here. And it's just, what's so great about that is you actually see when people lose track of they lose track of their people, or their people disappear, or their people get frustrated because they can't get close and turn around. And you just feel like people's anxiety and frustration and the depths of their worry and sorrow.
I still feel it. I still talk to some of our guys and, man, there was so much suffering at that airport. And those people were 110% committed to doing whatever they had to do to get out. And there was such a measure of trust, Dave, between these shepherds and their partners. And I remember one of my friends, Steve, and I think I talk about this in the book, but he was helping a young man and his family move through these checkpoints, and they were almost to the point where they could get to the fence, and they got stuck at a checkpoint, and they started beating his family. And Steve was on the phone with him, and he kept saying to him, Steve, they're beating my family. What do I do? Please tell me what to do. And Steve, and I've known him for years, man. I mean, this guy he's such a decent soul, and he's been through so much in his life. He said he just laid down on the floor, and he just beat the floor as hard as he could, and was biting his finger because he couldn't say anything, and he needed this guy to keep pressing. And how can we do that, man? How can we do that to our veteran population? How can we ask them to take that on? I'll never understand it as long as I live. And it has nothing to do with politics. This has nothing to do. I'll just never understand how we could lay that at the feet of a generation of war fighters who served us so faithfully for 20 years and ask them to do that. I'll just never understand it as long as I live.
When you said that there were people from the 82nd there, and you were talking to Marines, was there a general at the airport?
Yes, there were a couple of flag officers. There's Admiral Vasley, who was a Navy SEAL, and then there was General Donahue, who was in charge of the overall kind of the ground force NEO.
But you guys weren't doing a lot of coordination. You were calling the guard post, right? You were calling people right there at the gates a lot of times.
So there are different levels. So
okay.
One is the one thing is we had people in Pineapple that were very well placed. One of our guys, Matt Coburn, was the last Sejasotav commander in Afghanistan. So he knew Donahue, he knew Vaisley, and he was calling them directly and he was talking to them. And frankly, you know, to Matt's credit, he had Afghan commandos and special forces loaded on buses, manifested, ready to drive through with engines running. They would not open the gate. They would not open the gate while simultaneously allowing thousands, if not tens of thousands of CIA paramilitary and their families through. You know, and that's not a ding on the agency. I mean, good on them. They got their people out, but it really made no sense. I mean, even if you look at the national security memo, Dave, that came out on 14 August, the day before the withdrawal, they listed all of the priorities for evac, and the paramilitary force was on there. Any State Department employees, even if they had just started the day prior, were on that for a priority evacuation. You know who wasn't on there? Afghan commandos, Afghan special forces, all of the Afghan special operations, and the NMRG, the National Mine Reduction Group, who actually prevented insider threats against SEALs and Green Berets, were not on the list. They were not considered. They were not submitted. And again, this is where I'm asking, where's the accountability on that? How is a force that works by, with, and through partners, how could we not have our partners on that list as a priority for exfil, or at least some kind of exfil plan? There wasn't a special forces team on the ground, and there hadn't been for quite some time. The last SF teams had left the country. Why did we not have at least a couple of SF teams on the ground, you know, doing that bottom up, by, with, and through preparation for long-term resistance, right? I mean, it's just, we have to get to the bottom of this because it is a level of systemic abandonment that goes all the way back to the Montagnards. And I know we've kind of pivoted here, but there are so many veterans from the SOF community that are asking this question over and over again, and we got to answer.
It's one of the things that shocked me were the actual U.S. citizens that were outside the gate and couldn't get in.
It's true. There were a lot. And we had some, and we were working with Pineapple. I included one of them in the book.
Yeah.
There were actually more than that. Some of the cases that we had were crazy. I mean, I had a special advisor to Vice President Kamala Harris call my cell phone and ask, hey, can you help us get our Afghan out? You know, and I'm like, what?
Yeah.
Fucking planet are we on right now that you're calling a 52-year-old storyteller, you know, to get your guy out when you've got Delta sitting in a hangar? Just turn them loose. Let them do what they know, they want to do. But it was that kind of stuff was happening like crazy. Guys were getting phone calls from, the service chiefs, for God's sakes. And,
fundamentally broken system.
That's the exactly, like, you're a civilian, like, random, not just spontaneously stood up organization, and you are taking over the role of a governmental agency.
Oh yeah. And then, like, getting questions, as this thing drew out, we would get questions because we're trying to like get them safe houses, and we're trying to get them medical care because they can't go back to their home address because their homes have been compromised.
Right. When
they raided the Ministry of Defense. Right. And so these poor guys and their families have nowhere to go. That they can't even go home, and it's winter. And so we're asking questions, and we're trying to get these different congressionals involved. And they're asking us questions like, well, can you show us the vetting procedures? And I'm like, dude, I have a Mac laptop and a cell phone. Like, what part of this do you not understand? How in God's name would I know what their vetting is? I mean, I know I served with them, right, and I know he's legit, but all of that crap is with the Department of Defense. Why are you not asking them? And it just, the way this thing was redistributed onto the shoulders of our veteran population and the moral injury that has been incurred. I mean, we just lost another 20th guy to suicide, man, as a direct result of what happened in Afghanistan. And it's unfathomable to me. And the fact that we're not talking about it, and frankly, I'll just say it because, I don't really care anymore. Why did someone not throw their stars on the table? Like, at least one officer, senior officer at the flag officer level, could they not throw their stars on the table as a result of this? It just, again, all the guys I interviewed are asking that question, and no one seems to want to answer it.
And the administration's response was just to ignore it.
Of course. But, the other side of that thing too, man, I want to be really clear here. Like, this is both sides are equally underwhelming. I mean, if you look at the Doha agreement under Trump, that was basically what they executed, what the Biden administration executed. Just wrong-headed, not listening to the guys on the ground. It just frankly, as Jack said, from the time we started this thing at an administration level under multiple administrations, woefully underwhelming in their ability to understand or even try to understand the nature of the fight we were in, and to look at foreign internal defense and capacity building, for what needed to happen. It was just, I don't know. It was a comedy of errors, really.
And we've really seen that through the Bush administration, the Obama administration, the Trump administration. Like, we've seen it all throughout. It's the same music with a different dancer each time, it seems like.
I think so. And I mean, I talk about this in Game Changers. I mean, I had a ton of personal responsibility for things that went wrong in that war. To include a myopic focus on walking the enemy down for way too long because of, losing a friend. But there was a lot of other things that I got wrong in that war. A lot of things that all of us got wrong. But to me, it's like, okay, got it. We need to step back from this thing and look at what happened. Because if we don't start to make some kind of fundamental approach to getting our head around this abandonment, and more importantly, how we can keep it from happening again, it's going to happen again. And I don't know how many more mulligans we get on this.
Right.
Seriously, I don't know how many more mulligans we get on this. What if there's another ISIS attack, which very good chance there will be with the way they're reconstituting, and AQ in Afghanistan on the homeland, 3 to 5 years from now. Damn well when that happens, all the Budweiser commercials and the country music songs are going to kick off, and it's going to be our kids that are going to saddle up on these C-17s. They're going to go back into Afghanistan for payback, except this time, man, they're not going to be facing or like linking up with Northern Alliance, and Pashtun tribes to the south that are ready to get their gun on. They're going to be facing, pissed off former commandos, Afghan SF who have been on the run and hunted for 3 or 4 years and maybe co-opted at that point.
Right.
It's just a whole different thing. And again, I can't understand it. I can't understand why we're not at least working with the resistance in some way, while we're not providing humanitarian aid, humanitarian corridor to a 20-year partner.
You mean all the military gear that we left behind for the Taliban wasn't considered humanitarian aid?
Yeah, just there's so much there, man. And it's kind of both sides of the aisle, because the absence of just formal leadership, of somebody standing up,
right,
and really being heard, and at least in our community, we just our battle cry is nobody's coming. Right.
Were there any people in like Congress, left or right, but were there any people who stood up for you guys? Any veterans? Any civilians? Anybody who stood up?
Yeah, I mean, and I don't want to omit anybody, but I can tell you from my standpoint, Mike McCall, Mike Waltz, Dan Crenshaw, Tom Cotton, a lot of vets that were in Congress, but also I think Senator Shaheen. There were several that did and openly, and there were a lot of junior officers and NCOs across the active duty formation that took immense risks, and there were some civilians even in the Biden administration who were appointees who took risks. One of them was in Pineapple. So I don't want to give the impression that there weren't leaders stepping up, because there were, but for the most part, it wasn't, and it was just crickets. And a lot of these formal institutional leaders at the diplomatic, military, and policy level, what they did was they called their buddies who were retired and gave them the names and numbers of the guys they needed to get out, and then they just went back to work.
With the guys who are on active duty, the guys and girls who are on active duty, what did they do that put them at risk or put their jobs at risk? Like what was the level of risk there?
Well, I mean, there were guys like Jeff Dardia and others in the groups, and I talk about some of them in the book, who set up operation centers in their day rooms and in their, the battalion classroom. Some of them took leave and, just worked and didn't sleep. They just stayed at the unit. I think every single SF group did some version of that. And, with or without the tacit approval of probably the highest level, the battalion commander, group commander may have known about it. I don't know. But like these guys were actively working inside the volunteer groups. Some of them were standing up their own volunteer groups, but a lot of them were part of Pineapple and other groups. So, if you think about it, the level of just, and maybe not as much risk in that regard, but there were guys at the airfield, particularly the dudes that we worked with in the 82nd, and some of the other folks that were on the diplomatic front. They basically worked right alongside us as a coexisting mechanism to move Afghans in duress from the crowd through the corridor into the fence, and then, get them on an airplane. And they were doing that on their own, man. They made those decisions to do that on their own, and incurred a lot of risk to themselves too. The 82nd guys were going outside that hole in the fence, and had the first sergeant not stop to smoke a cigarette before they ran out to make one more pull of pineapples. A lot of those 82nd guys would have been there when that ISIS-K bomb went off. They were just on the other side of the blast wall when it went off, only because Jesse Kennedy decided to smoke a cigarette before they jumped in their trucks to do one more pull. So the level of risk that those folks incurred, all of the folks really at HKIA, both physically and in some cases for their career, was immeasurable.
Yeah. Yeah, really, people really stood up. I thought the story about, I can't remember his name, but the red sunglasses.
Captain Red Sunglasses.
Yeah. Can you tell
John
that story? Because that's a great story.
Yeah, I mean, the part of the Pineapple Express that was, the active duty component from the 82nd was Captain John Folta and his first sergeant, Jesse Kennedy. And both of them were just amazing human beings who were, responsible for a part of the perimeter, but it was kind of a security in depth. So they had the latitude to follow commander's intent, which is if you have the opportunity and you can still maintain security to help Afghans at risk, go for it. And that's what they did. And so they became the conductors who would pull in the folks on the Underground Railroad through the hole in the fence. And towards the end, the security situation was getting really bad. We knew there was an ISIS bomber in the midst somewhere. And so most of the final period of darkness, that's when we would run the express. The person would drop down in the sewage canal. They would move through it. And then when they saw a green chem light at the designated place, that was the 82nd guy, they would hold up the pineapple on their phone. They would read off the info on the baseball cards, make sure it matched, and then pull them in. But the last period of darkness, we lost the whole period of darkness because of the security threat. And so we were now looking at a daylight pull. And we knew that the final day for the NEO was at hand. Plus there was this ISIS bomber that was making it really, really challenging, that kept getting reports on. So Captain Folta advised us. He's like, we're going to do a daylight pull. We hadn't done that at this point. And he said, so, the near recognition signal or far recognition signal will be, I'll be in red sunglasses. And somebody asked, well, how will we know? And he goes, trust me, you'll know. And they just happened to be just these gaudy Oakley red sunglasses that he had in his backpack. And he put them on. And it just, if you go back and read through the chat room now, you can hear all the guys talking about, yeah, the dude's got red sunglasses on. And they just started calling him Captain Red Sunglasses. There's even a picture of him in the book posing with some Afghans they pulled out. But yeah, it worked, and it was ingenious, and it allowed the Afghans and us for us to pass bona fides that were easily understood and in very simple and a chaotic time that made the difference in hundreds more getting pulled out.
It's an incredible story, and once again, I want to recommend anybody who wants a good story and some real situational awareness about this is a month worth of time, really, a little over a month, I suppose, but
Yeah.
it's riveting.
Do we have any questions for Scott?
Yeah.
Want to pull those up? Yeah, so Operation Pineapple is the book that his Scott's other book is Game Changers. This is really about VSO, and this is really like a manual, isn't it, Scott? About how you guys did this.
There's two versions of it, Jack. Actually, there's this version right here, Game Changers. It's called the Abridged Citizens Edition. So if you want kind of the shorter read about how VSO works, and then there's the larger version that you're handling that I really wrote for special operators, security force assistance brigades, and law enforcement. And
Awesome.
it is more of an application.
All right. Robert C., thank you very much. Much has been written about the collapse of the conventional ANA. Where do you think we went wrong with the conventional ANA, and what main reason caused the collapse of ANASOC specifically?
So with the conventional ANA, I believe, and I started working with them very early on, like I said, in 04, 05, we tried to create a partner force in our own image. And that was a real mistake because that was not sustainable. If you look at how our military operates, it's overwhelming firepower, it's superior training, but it's also a lot of high technology, high-end equipment that requires contractor oversight. It's a lot of intel dependent, exploitation of targets where you have to have intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance platforms in the air. All of that stuff is super high maintenance, super high tech. And you're talking about, privates in the ANA that couldn't read, that were 14 and 15 years old. Mm-hmm. And a standing army that was only at the time when we stood it up, it was non-existent, and its maturity, it was 19 years old. And then you look at these guys walking around dressed like us, and we just built them in our own image. Which, okay, fine. Then you damn sure better make sure that you keep the contract support in place. Mm-hmm. I interviewed on my podcast General Sami Sadat, who was fighting in Helmand and was very, very highly regarded and still is Afghan Special Operations General who did not run. He's in the movie Retrograde, if you want to see a wonderful movie and what he did until the bitter end. But Sammy told me, he said they were fighting in Helmand. The Americans were long gone out of the local area. SF teams were gone. And this was like in June, I think. And his air boss walked into his office and said, "General, we can't fly today." And he was like, "Why not?" And he goes, "All the contractors are gone.
Yeah.
They left. They're out of the country." And so to answer your question, I mean, we literally pulled all of the contractors out of Afghanistan without warning in June of 2021. And there was no way that those platforms could fly. They couldn't do medevac. I don't know many units in the U.S. military that are going to run operations nowadays without a medevac. Right. But that's what they were doing. And so, it was building it in our own image and then and then pulling the plug on the operating mechanisms, the support mechanisms that needed to keep it functioning after we were gone. And as far as the Afghan National Army Special Ops, they fought until the bitter end. They were fighting long after the government collapsed. Many of them are still fighting right now. They're in the resistance. They're fighting back, but the command collapsed about the same time that Kabul did. But General Sadat, General Alizai, they wanted to keep fighting, and they approached the U.S. Flag officers and had a plan for Kabul, and they wouldn't hear it.
It's amazing. Another really interesting story is one of the gentlemen who actually made it to the States and realized that there was nothing in the States for him, and he went back to Afghanistan to fight.
Yeah, Kazem. I changed his name, but he was an interpreter to Captain Will Lyles, who lost both legs, an SF guy doing VSO up at Cobra Base, Fire Base Ties, I believe, in Uruzgan province, and his interpreter Kazem helped save his life. And then the tables were turned where Kazim had since evolved into a pretty elite operator for the NDS, working regionally in Nimroz province, and was there when the Nimroz NDS headquarters was overrun, and was the guy that blew the ammo bunker and did the final retrograde out of there, and then fought his way across Afghanistan all the way to Kabul. And when he finally saw that there was no way, that there was no resistance in place to speak of, he decided to go ahead and get out of there with his brother, made it to the States, and was living the high life in North Carolina with a sponsor, and just, he couldn't do it. He said to Will on the phone, he said, all I've ever known in my entire life is killing Taliban. And he's like, I don't even like the taste of food, and the next day he was gone. And Will got a message that he was back in Afghanistan, and he's still there fighting.
It's incredible. Brad, thank you very much. Senior play in Santa Barbara. Really like the 20-year team sergeant SF guy. Said only people who haven't seen enough war thirst for it.
Yeah, well said. And, one of the greatest honors of my life in terms of storytelling is the opportunity to play a team sergeant in this play, to do a play and a story about an SF NCO, a senior NCO, and share his story. I will tell you that I interviewed a lot of team sergeants, even though I worked with a lot of them anyway. I interviewed dozens and dozens of team sergeants for this role, and I still do, because I find their perspective to be fascinating. And I really want them to inform my character, not just, in what I say, but in my physicality. So I appreciate you saying that. And I really hope that I do embody what you just said, because Danny Patton in this play, while he longs to get back to the fight, it's because it's out of love for the people that he protects, to include his Afghan partners and his Afghan families. And I think a lot of people don't understand that.
Mm-hmm. Robert, thanks again. How did VSO handle corruption in local security forces, being that militia ALP abuse corruption were central drivers of the rural insurgency?
That's a great point. I think once we regulated or conventionalized ALP, I think we lost the ability to control that. It was it's just kind of a catch-22, right? Because you want to pay these forces to some degree, and you want to have some level of accountability to the central government. It is desirable, but I think we missed the mark on that. I think once we started paying these guys, I think we lost the ability to really regulate any kind of graft or corruption or patronage. It just got out of hand. And then once we pulled the teams, it was still manageable. But then when you pulled the teams out of the villages, that was when it all fell apart. That was when all the regulatory and responsible oversight, which you need to have when you do this kind of work, it fell away, because there was no way that you could do these episodic visits from a fire base to a village and think that you're going to somehow maintain responsible oversight of things like pay and logistics and even behavior of how the ALP operated when you weren't there.
Right.
And so I would say that the real where it came off the rails was when we moved teams out of the villages and took away their ability for persistent oversight.
Ahmed Akhtab, thank you very much. Thank you for your service, Lieutenant Colonel. Sad that politically motivated and artificial deadlines doomed what could have been a successful strategy. Do you see the similarities with the abandonment of the Kurds in Syria? Merry Christmas.
Yes, I do. Thank you for those words. And I absolutely do. I think, in fact, if you look at our history of working with partners, it is abysmal. You can walk it all the way back to the Mungs, the Montagnards. Even the Shah's regime in Iran, the Kurds in Syria, the Iraqi police and military, the Afghans. And really, we abandoned Afghanistan twice. There was an abandonment that happened, when the Soviets came in as well. So I think there's a lot of similarities there. And this goes back to what we were talking about, Dave, where if we don't find a way, I think it's going to have to come from Congress. It's the only thing I can figure, some kind of congressional inquiry or oversight that really pursues accountability and mandates crystallized learning to come out of this, because and one, for a national security so that it doesn't happen again, but two, the moral injury that has been heaped upon our veteran population. Our flag officers, in my assessment, are not responding to that. And there's a lot of studies on moral injury that show that one of the biggest things that needs to happen is leader involvement, acknowledgement of what happened, and then measures in place so that the people that have experienced that moral injury know it won't happen again. And if you look at the recruiting and retention numbers right now, I think it's a reflection of the fact that the bulk of your recruits nowadays come from military families, and military family members are saying to their kids, I wouldn't join if I were.
Yeah.
Think twice about this.
Yeah. I think another challenge is we never knew what victory looked like. Like in my opinion, we won with, as soon as we defeated AQ, right? We won. Then we decided to just hang out. And there was, like, if you have a sport, you have, like, when you win. If you set a goal, when you achieve that goal. We had no goals.
Yeah. No, I think that's right, man. And it ebbed and flowed, didn't it, with each administration? And I do believe that there was a legitimate requirement for remote foreign internal defense. And I do believe that there was a legitimate requirement for long-term CT support in that country. And honestly, if you think about it, we were the Afghan special operators were really magnificent. Mm-hmm. They really were. The special mission wing was magnificent. So you had a force that was really taking the fight to the enemy. And I think had we kept some measure of VSO in place, particularly with Afghan special forces in the lead, we could have maintained a presence in the rural areas. So I think there was and still is a need for capacity building in that country. And I think there's going to be, because here's the thing, Dave, if you think about how ISIS-K, AQ, how do they operate? They're doing exactly what they're doing in Afghanistan right now. They go into at-risk, undergoverned areas. They set up shop so that they can plan, train, project, and attack from these safe haven areas. And the best antibody to that is a local presence of some kind. And that's what we were moving towards, and I think that Al-Qaeda is not going to go away. ISIS-K is not going to go away. So we're going to have to operate against them. And I don't think we should bail on this local approach. I think it is very doable, but we're going to have to get our policymakers and our senior officers, up to speed on what this looks like. And I think the SF regiment's going to have to get over this, this identity crisis and figure out what we're doing.
Right. And Ahmed, thank you very much again. Can you please say more about what you called an incoming mental health tsunami and causes, and why many veterans feel like strangers in their own country?
That's a great question. There's a range of studies that show that the post 9/11 population is really affected by, look, we already had a suicide rate of 22 a day, but now they're saying that that the Veterans Administration actually did not count overdoses. So it could be as much as 44 a day. I think the number of active duty and post 9/11 veteran suicides is something like 37,000, right? And those are really a lot of them are battlefield casualties, aren't they? I mean, there are a lot of things that carried over from the battlefield, and this was really all going on before the Afghan abandonment. All right, so if you take 44 a day, and then a latest study that came in about how veterans are reacting to the Afghan withdrawal, 775,000 Afghan war veterans, 73% of them say they are betrayed, and 67% feel humiliated. So you take those numbers and you apply them against what we were already looking at with mental health, suicide, depression, alcoholism, and this moral injury of abandoning allies and the guilt that goes with that. A lot of these guys are trying to keep them alive. They're still on the phone with them. Yeah, I do. I think we're on the front end of a tsunami of mental health that is going to start. And we've already seen just in our little community, like 3 suicides that are directly attributed to the Afghan withdrawal within a year, and so I just, and traveling with the play and doing these talkbacks already, what the veterans are saying in the rooms, man, they are hot. They are hot. And I look at our flag officers, there's nothing coming out of them about this. There's no engagement. There's no outreach. I've even heard flag officers say that, that we should get over this betrayal thing because it makes us look like victims. And I just, the tone deaf level that comes with that is amazing to me. But I do think that we're going to start seeing a range of mental health issues, largely infused by a moral injury if we don't start engaging like now.
Scott, we talked about this with Kate, but a lot of viewers probably haven't heard that term, moral injury. I think it's a relatively new term, or at least, kind of being spread now. Can you tell us a little bit about what that is and what it means?
I had never really heard much about it until after the Afghanistan thing happened, and our volunteer community, the Pineapple folks, and then others, we formed this thing called Moral Compass, and it's like a 22 organization federation of volunteers. Operation Sacred Promise, Flanders Fields, and others. There's volunteer groups that were in this thing from the beginning, and we started to notice that there were just a lot of issues with people in our groups that were experiencing high degrees of guilt, depression. They had cashed in their kids' 401 or college savings funds. They were really experiencing, and the guys they were trying to keep alive were murdered, and then they'd get a videotape of it sent to them courtesy of the Taliban that did it, because they'd see the number in their phone. And we started digging into this. We're like, what's going on here? And so I personally started researching. I heard this term moral injury being talked about a lot with the Afghanistan withdrawal, and it turns out that a moral injury, it doesn't even have a formal diagnosis in the mental health community yet. It is more of a syndrome, but it's gaining a lot of traction, and it's really a violation of one's values, of one's core values, in a way that it injures the soul, and the problem with it is, like, when you couple that, it's not the same as post-traumatic stress. It's not the same as a TBI, obviously. But what it is a compromise of one's values and damage to the soul. And so it can really accelerate. It can accentuate the impacts of already pre-existing trauma or stress or anxiety. And the levels of guilt that come with it are just astronomical. And so there's a lot of concern that this moral injury that's been, heaped on the shoulders of so many of our veterans and active duty members right now, that it's going to take them out. It's going to take them out because there's, the way that you recover from a moral injury is it requires leaders to get involved with that. Like I said, it requires some demonstrable action that it's being addressed. I think something like 2/3 of Afghan war veterans say that their mental health would improve if they could see their partners resettled. There's a lot there that's going to require leader involvement and leader engagement to address this thing. And I think it's real. I really do. I think it is an injury that's as palpable and real as a broken leg. And I see it every day in so many of these volunteers in the way that it's taken them down.
And like you say, it's the same way that TBI and post-traumatic stress are sort of aggregators, where where it starts bleeding together, where they can't tell them apart sometimes.
I think they're related. I'm also not a doctor, but I think moral injuries happen when a person either has to participate in or witness something they fundamentally disagree with, or, as you say, grinds against their core values. And when that happens, I think that leads directly into what we call post-traumatic stress.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is a participatory thing, and then there's it could come in the variety of where you've done it yourself, or where you were put in the position where it happened, and that violation occurred by leaders that you trusted.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And in this case, that's really at the heart of this is that this violation occurred in such a way that, we were all raised and trained and held to a certain standard that you do not abandon a partner on the battlefield. That's
Right.
you just don't do that.
Right.
And you were held accountable for that. Like that was an expectation to operate in the field that we operated in, and then to bear witness to your own government, even your own mentors, as in my case, men that I revered, right? Turning the page on this thing as if it didn't happen.
That's tough.
I don't even know what to do with that, and the level of disillusionment that comes from that, and potentially harmful outcomes, as you said, Dave, when that gets combined with these other things. And there is a trauma to it, certainly.
Yeah.
With some of the things that happened, there was a level of trauma with that, particularly if it resulted in allies getting killed or wounded, as it did a lot in this situation. But we've got to, right now, I mean, I'm asking you guys, do you see any senior leaders talking about this?
No.
Or identifying this in the public space?
Down the memory hole.
The only thing I've heard senior leaders saying is, you guys are acting like victims. Get over it. And it's just unbelievable that or there's just nothing said at all.
Or was it the Secretary of the Army who said the reason why the Army is having recruiting issues is because of negative media reports?
That's right.
It's like the media didn't create this debacle in Kabul.
No.
For its many failings, this one I don't think you can lay at the laps of the media.
No, for sure. And I think there was even a comment about we needed to get the veterans more involved in recruiting. And, right now veterans are very involved in recruiting. And it's basically,
Right.
I had an SF team sergeant say to me, if I'd known then what I know now about how we would treat our partners, I would never have walked down to the recruiting station the day after 9/11 and become an SF
That's
baby.
brutal.
And he said, my son, as far as I'm concerned, will never serve in the Army.
Right.
And this was a guy who is iconic in 5th Group, man. I mean, this dude is as good as I've ever seen. And he was in tears because the guy that he had been helping had just been assassinated, and he had the tape on his phone.
Jesus.
And, he was just broken,
Yeah.
just broken, and one of the guys in our play, Chris Fetzel, if you come see it, the guy got a big beard, was blown up in Iraq, buried alive, dug himself out, just a grunt, and was such a proud service member and did so much veteran work. And he almost didn't do the play. And I asked him why. And he said, I really don't want anybody to know I was in the Army.
Yeah, you have all these guys who are feeling shame when they shouldn't, because they didn't do anything that was shameful. I mean, serving your country isn't shameful.
Yeah.
And
the other reason we're doing the play. Yeah.
One last question. Thank you again, Ahmed. One last question. What do you think the future holds for counterinsurgency and counterterrorism operations in the post-Afghanistan world?
It's a great question. I unfortunately, I think we've left with some very bad lessons that direct action or surgical strike alone is all that you need to deal with violent extremist groups. And I think that is a very, very flawed approach. Mm-hmm. I think that it serves a purpose. It is very useful, but I think that the local approach to building capacity and an antibody to violent extremists in their deepest sanctuary is the only way to create a lasting countermeasure to violent extremism. I'm not sure counterinsurgency is a viable thing. I think large-scale conventional footprints in societies, civil societies that are mostly status, it's a square peg in a round hole. It doesn't work.
Yeah.
I think we get back to a more agile, focused foreign internal defense approach with special operators and maybe a very small handful of conventional forces as a hammer, and build as much partner capability in the partner special ops world as we can for both strike and capacity building. Not just strike, but we need to build a host nation capacity building capability where they can go into their own villages, work with the police, work with the local army, work with the irregular forces, and behave responsible and model what it looks like to be a warrior for your community and a catalyst. And I think it's very doable. I think it's very, very doable. We can do that. But we've got to, that lesson has not been, it's not been appreciated at any level within the SOLVE community or certainly the policymaker community.
I have to be honest that I don't have high hopes because we repeated all the exact same mistakes in Afghanistan that we made in Vietnam. And not we as soldiers, but as a country, as an administration.
Yeah, and the next war is not going to be fought by the three of us. It's going to be a new generation of young people who have never seen any of this.
Never. And, you're so right, Jack. And that's what, again, I talk about this in my epilogue. I lay out the scenario, how this goes down. Like, I've already pretty much got my next post 9/11 testimony ready to go. It's so predictable. It's just disgusting how predictable it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I just noticed, we can't catch all the comments that where people don't donate, but I saw something go by from Shadow Sniffy. Hey, Mr. Scott, it's Becca's child. Becca.
Wow. Huh. Dang. That's really cryptic.
Well,
I'll probably figure it out as soon as we get off here.
Scott, I really appreciate you joining us on the show tonight. To kind of wrap things up, what's next for you? Are you going on tour with Last Out? You said several times I need to see the new version of the play. Where can people go and see it?
Yeah, so the first thing I would say is, any of the stuff that we talked about tonight, if you're interested, at scottmann.com. I've got my whole body of work to include my nonprofit stuff is there. The website is lastoutplay.com. And we're going to be posting our tour stops there. But I will say our next two tour stops, Jack, and I would love for you to make it down if you could, is January 6th through 8th in D.C. at Catholic University in D.C. It's like a preview. It's a very small playhouse where we're doing it. And then we're in Steppenwolf in Chicago, January 20 and 21. And that's going to be really, really cool. That's going to be a big show. It's kicking off the national tour, like 400 seats. And then we'll be going to Alabama, Arizona, just a whole host of places. And we're going to have the tour stops up, hopefully within the next week or so, on lastoutplay.com. And if you can't make the play, please check it out on Amazon. Again, the name of the play is Last Out.
It's awesome. And again, the book is Game Changers and Operation Pineapple are the two books. And you'll find links down in the description to Last Out and everything else we've talked about here tonight. Scott, really, thank you for joining us on a late evening on Friday. Talk about all this stuff. Really important conversation, I think. And it's just been really great. I hope we can have you on again sometime. Next Friday, pre-recorded episode is going to be with Shawnee Delaney, who's a DIA humanter. So that'll be out, and then in first show in January, we'll be doing a New Year's roundup. So that's what's coming up in the next 2 weeks. I hope everyone out there has a Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, Happy Festivus. Tomorrow night's Christmas Eve. So thank you again, everyone. Scott, again, thanks, man. Really appreciate it.
Really appreciate it.
Dave, Jack, appreciate you guys.
All right, and we'll see you next week with